So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Culture Studies. So we're going to have a group session today. So I've invited my class today to participate in this session where we have a very informal interaction, basically a conversation about this course. Just taking you through some of the texts which we have covered so far, and also have a more generic discussion about the purpose of this course, the aims and objectives which a course like this ought to have. Okay, so a very warm welcome to our class who have come over. I've got my two TAs as well, Shivashi Roy and Lakshmi Chitra, who are here in the session. So we just start with the very basic question, the very generic question that we started off with this course, and that is, what is culture and what's the aim and purpose of doing a course like this, cultural studies? So if we could get some responses from the group, that'd be great. So what do you mean by culture? So if I just give you the word culture randomly, how would you define it? What would be your working definition? Culture as an entity, as a phenomenon, as a process, how would you define it?
Set of codes, values, which is prevailing in a particular society.
Okay, a set of codes, values which prevail in a particular society at any particular point of time. So culture is something temporal. It belongs to a certain historical frame. So there can be no such thing as the human culture. I mean, we always talk about cultures because they are notoriously context sensitive. And there's a coded quality about culture as well. It is a set of codes. Sometimes it's cryptic in the sense that, you know, some of the codes are quite mysterious. Some of the codes are very notoriously well preserved, etc. And the codes are replicable. They are played out across different historical situations. So there's a coded quality about culture. So culture as a set of codes is a good definition. Anything else that one can contribute to it?
Cultures are organic.
Okay.
They keep changing. There's an mutability of it.
Okay, very good. So let's rephrase the question, and so let me ask you, what are the adjectives of culture? So we got, you know, the coded quality as being one adjective of culture, organicity or organic, another adjective of culture. Any other qualifiers, any other markers of culture? It's coded, it's organic, mutable.
Discursivity.
Yes, discursivity is one of those terms which I'm sure all of you attending this course have heard it many times, numerous times. It's one of my pet terms, discursivity. What is discursivity? Since we have discursivity, let me just trigger a conversation about discursivity. How would you define discursivity? It's obviously related to discourse. It's something to do with discourse. What is discourse and what is discursivity? How would you define discursivity?
Dominant belief in a particular society, which enforces the discursive practices of the individuals, and those practices again reinforces the idea of discourse.
Right, very good. So it's a bit of a loop, really. So, and again, this is something that I've been saying since the very inception of the course. So what we need to do in culture studies is we question the boundaries between the inside and the outside. So the organic interior human being as an autonomous individual and the discursive individual who's a social animal. So that boundary needs to be re-questioned, right? So we question the boundary, we question the borderline between these two. So discursivity can become an affective phenomenon, it can become an existential phenomenon, and of course, like you said very correctly, it is also an apparatus, a sort of an artificial apparatus which contain rules, values, ideologies, laws, legal codes, etc. So discursivity is a very complex entanglement, again, one of my pet phrases in this course, a very complex asymmetric entanglement between the inside and the outside, between the human individual existential self and the more extended social self, etc. So we're looking at culture as a process, culture as a play between the inside and the outside, culture as a negotiation with codes, culture as a navigation with the artificial apparatus of discourses, values, ideologies around us. Okay, so having defined culture, it's a good definition of culture to begin with. So what do you think would be the purpose of cultural studies? As students of cultural studies, all of us over here in this room are students of cultural studies. So what would be ideally our purpose in terms of doing this course, cultural studies? What do you think this course should be designed to do?
To study culture as a text.
Okay, good. So study culture as a text, which means the assumption obviously here is we're looking at the textual quality of culture. So culture is a text which can be written, rewritten, etc. It's like a CD-ROM. It can be rewritten all over again. It can be deleted. It can be erased, and after it's erased, new codes can be set into it, etc. So the writability or the inscriptive quality of culture is something that we are very interested in. Culture as a text material, culture as a textual phenomenon, which can be written, rewritten, replayed, etc. And obviously, the moment you use the word text, it's a very useful word. A text is something which is obviously constructed. It is a construct, and anything which can be constructed can also be deconstructed and reconstructed. So again, we're looking at culture as a deconstructible text, so something which can be deconstructed. So deconstruction becomes a very useful critical theory in cultural studies, right? I mean, as some of you would know, I mean, most of the texts which we have drawn on, they sort of directly or indirectly pay debt to deconstruction in a massive way. So bring in deconstruction as an investigative strategy, as a tool to examine certain texts, etc. So I mean, by deconstruction, I not just mean Derrida, but the entire phenomenon of deconstruction, right? So the entire idea of questioning text, questioning the constructed quality of text, etc. Okay, so talking about text, let's move on very quickly to some of the texts which we have covered in this course so far. Some of the key texts that we have examined for the purpose of this course. So starting with, for instance, George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, which is sort of an autobiographical essay about what happened to him once in Burma when he was a colonial police officer. So how to read that particular essay as a cultural text? Again, mind you, it's an autobiographical essay. It's deeply personal, subjective. So again, we're back to this loop between the personal subjective and the discursive objective, and how the borderlines blur away. So if you treat Orwell's essay, Shooting an Elephant, as a text which is relevant to culture studies, how would you begin to look at it as a cultural text? In terms of the events, yes.
Because it's highly coded, he is performing this
Yes.
a specific role, that is the white male supremacy in that context.
Right.
So this is where he gets to perform, and he feels like he has the agency over there.
Mhm.
So this is highly coded in a way. So
Yeah, very good. So we have some very key terms. So the coded quality in the text, the performativity in the text. So he is coded, he is codified. He's not so much an individual as a code, right? He's a code who is supposed to perform a certain function. And again, the context becomes very important over here. So if it were Burma 2018, this would make no sense at all. But this is Burma 1930s, which is colonial Burma, where the white man is basically a god, and the white man has supposedly all the agency to control, to tame, to civilize, etc. So all that lovely narratives about imperialism being a civilizing mission, that's rampant at that time. So it is that context out of which this essay emerges, right? And Orwell, of course, over there is a colonial officer whose job is to preserve and perpetuate the supremacy of the white race, right? So he's there as an agent, a reluctant agent, but still an agent on a payroll of the empire. So he's someone who's carrying on the function of the empire in that sense. So immediately what strikes us when we read that essay is the coded quality of the essay. So it's very coded. So he is a colonial police officer in Burma, and immediately we are in a set of codes, right? We are in a set of functions, in a set of performances, right? So that, again, that takes away the individuality of the author, the individuality of the human subject. An entire essay, if you read it at an existential level, it is about the liquidation of individuality. It's about the exhaustion of individuality. There's no individuality left. You are a function. You're a code. And it's a job to carry out that code. Okay, how else would you read that essay? It's a very good start. How else would you read that essay as a cultural document? Shooting an Elephant?
Reading it along Homi Bhabha's idea of stereotype and colonial
Yes.
ambivalence, we can see how ambivalence is executed in a space.
Okay.
And how the power is not just unidirectional, but there is a multi-directional flow
Good.
of agency power.
Exactly. So the entire essay becomes a very good execution of what Homi Bhabha, and this brings us to a second text. Thank you so much for that. It brings us to a second text of Bhabha's The Other Question, where he's basically theorizing the production of the other. And he's looking at how the other becomes a very complex production. It's not just unidirectional, as you very correctly pointed out. The power doesn't flow from the colonizer to the colonized. It's not just that simple. That's a very reductionist way of looking at colonial power. Actually, power is more complex than that. It consumes the colonized as well as the colonizer. And the entire essay, Shooting the Elephant, is about being consumed by power in more ways than one. So what we see in the essay is obviously a very good example of ambivalence, right? Bhabha talks about ambivalence in terms of the colonial stereotype, because he says quite clearly the stereotype needs to be preserved in two supposedly contradictory ways. And the contradictory ways are, A, it should be permanent, and it should be replayable ad infinitum. So it should be able to play a stereotype over and over again in different discursive climates. And it also should be permanent, right? Now, when we bring that theory to Shooting the Elephant, which we do in this particular course, we see that how the supremacy of the white man is a permanent phenomenon, right? That's a given, that's something that construct is never questioned, right? So if that's questioned, the entire machinery will fail, right? So that's a given, that's a presupposition. So there's a presupposition of privilege there, the white man is the superior race, etc. And what is also simultaneously true is that the supremacy of the white man should be played over and over again through different events, through different performances. So the shooting of the elephant becomes a very symbolic act. And this brings me to the next question that I'll just sort of dish out to you, and that is, how would you read the event in the essay, the act of shooting the elephant? How would you read the symbolic act? What symbolic function do you think that event carries? I mean, it carries several symbolic functions, shooting the elephant, but can you just start off with a few?
Well, one of it is that Orwell is forced to do it so as to preserve the white man's superiority, and he doesn't get a choice.
Right, okay. So in a very symbolic sense, it becomes an act of annihilation of the agency. So the human agency is being killed. And those of you, all of you read the essay, but if you remember that essay, the elephant is increasingly humanized in the essay. So the entire act of killing the elephant is described as a murder, which is obviously a very human metaphor. So elephant is humanized. There's a degree of empathy between the elephant and the Orwell. And the symbolic killing of the elephant becomes also the killing of the self, the agency, the agentic self that Orwell has, which becomes completely secondary, tertiary, peripheral, compared to the discursive self, which needs to be preserved, the discursive self, which needs to be preserved over and above the deep existential self. Anything else? I mean, how else would you read it as a symbolic act? I mean, related to what you just said. What else is happening with the shooting of the elephant? What kind of an act is it? What's the adjective that you might use to describe that act, shooting of the elephant? Performative, perhaps? Okay. I mean, it is performative because Orwell is not just performing the white man's role, but he's also making it spectacular, right? So the spectacle of the act, the spectacular quality of the act is something which needs to be highlighted. And if you remember the essay, lots of theatrical metaphors are used. The curtains go up, the people are behind him, expecting for the event to happen. They've come to consume it visually, etc. Which brings us to the other important term for this course, performativity, which then I'll use to connect it to the other important text, which we have covered, that is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Right now, you can read. There are several ways you can read the Orwell essay. You can read, you can use Bhabha's The Other Question to read it. You can also use Butler's Gender Trouble to look at Orwell in that particular essay. Now, what is Gender Trouble about?
Performative of genders.
The performative quality of gender. So, how does Butler define gender in Gender Trouble?
Gender is something constructed and something that is performed.
Exactly. So in other words, what you just said a little while ago is completely true about gender. That is gender being a textual act. So gender as a text, which can be constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed. Right? So the textuality of gender becomes very important in Gender Trouble. And if you look at the title of Gender Trouble, the word trouble is quite indicative over here. So what does it want to trouble? It wants to trouble the very normative understanding of gender. Right, the very heteronormative understanding of gender, the very constructed quality of gender that is being deconstructed in that particular book. So in many sense, that particular work, Gender Trouble, it ticks many boxes. I mean, it's obviously a book on gender studies, but it's also deeply post-structuralist, it's deeply post-modernist, and it can be related to colonial studies as well, because it gives you the theory through which identities are produced. So in a very interesting sense, the book is about production, right? Production of identities. And again, we're looking at the blurring borderlines between the biological and the ideological, and how the borderlines between the biological and ideological blur away in that kind of a extreme discursive climate, where what you are as a body, what you are as a self, is immediately discursive. So this brings us to the idea of the entanglement between corporeality and discursivity. So what do I mean when I say that? That corporeality and discursivity are entangled. It's actually a very simple thing. I'm just using some complex words, but what am I saying essentially when I say corporeality and discursivity are entangled?
The discourse has the potential to affect your the way you behave, like your performativity. Everything is
Right.
influenced by the discourse.
Exactly.
So it extends to your body.
Exactly.
Right. Your body needs to perform in a certain way,
Right.
like the text says, or like
Mhm.
the narrative says.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So corporeality is a very complex phenomenon of embodiment, which is neural, psychological, all of that is very neural, psychological, cerebral, that's fine, but also it's deeply discursive. So by embodiment, I not just mean how the body functions at a biological level, but also how the body dresses up, how the body behaves, how the body picks up language, what kind of a linguistic register is being used by the body at any given point of time, etc. Right? So these are very discursive decisions that a body takes, that a self takes at any given point of time. So what Butler says quite clearly is that a human subject is never pre-discursive. Right? So the entire idea of a pre-discursive human subject is questioned by Butler, and in that sense she's questioning the very white Enlightenment canon of looking at consciousness as some kind of autonomous romantic activity which is divorced from discursivity. Right? So that is being questioned by Butler altogether. So this very Cartesian notion of consciousness, which is you can generate yourself by just thinking. You don't need the artificial apparatus around you. You think, therefore you become something. That romantic idea is obviously a very reified idea as well. And again, we're looking at the collusion between romance and reification, which is something which is rampant in gender studies. So you romanticize something, you also reify that simultaneously. It works with gender, it works with the human body in every which way. You objectify that. But also, at a more consciousness studies level, if you look at the way the Cartesian frame works, I think, therefore I am, becomes a very inward-looking enterprise, which moves away quite deliberately and quite stubbornly from the discursive apparatus around you. So I don't need it. So I look inward and I produce myself out of it, which is obviously a very male fantasy. And if you look at Enlightenment as a phenomenon, it's very, very male. It's very white. Right? It's very white and very male, and that has been questioned by Butler in gender studies and Gender Trouble, that book that she writes, which is quite seminal in a way. It deconstructs the many myths about gender, the many myths about identity production, etc. So one of the many things which that book does is that it questions any idea of pre-discursivity, any idea of meta-discursivity, etc. Which brings us to the other important text that we covered so far, and that is Lyotard, the postmodern condition. Now, in postmodern condition, Lyotard talks about language games quite a lot. That's something that he goes back to, drawing on Wittgenstein, drawing on many other philosophers. So what are language games, according to Lyotard, and how are language games related to the idea of the demise of the grand narrative? Because that's what the book is all about, the postmodern condition. It talks about the demise of the grand narrative. There's no grand narrative left. Instead, what we have are language games. So what are language games in the context of this death of the grand narrative? How would you define language games? What are language games as defined by Lyotard? So perhaps you can look at language games as different micro activities, right? Different micro activities which include language, include embodiment, include discursivity, corporeality, etc. So those language games come with a set of preset codes. So he used the analogy of chess, for instance. So in a chess game, for instance, we have some preset codes which are agreed upon. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the game of chess in the first place. However, once you start playing the game of chess, then as a player, as an intelligent player, you have the choice of combining and permuting different moves. But the macro narrative of rules must be maintained. So you can't make a queen go in another direction. right? That if you do that, the game will come to an end, right? So the very condition of the game is that set of macro rules should be maintained, but within that set of macro rules, you have the liberty to make iterations the way you want to. So each move becomes an iteration, right? So it becomes an iterative activity. So you make a particular piece go in a particular way, following the bigger network. So what we're talking about here is discursive fields, right? So it's a helpful analogy to think of discursive fields as a magnetic field, right? So no object escapes the discursive field. So all of us are part of a discursive field at any given point of time. Now, the only way you can assert our agency, and this is something Butler says as well, is within the discursive field. So Butler and Lyotard both sort of seem to agree on this, that any attempt or any aspiration to transcend discursivity, to transcend the discursive field is a romantic aspiration which ends up being a failure and which ends up being consumed by the grand narrative. So the acknowledgement of discursivity is something that Butler and Lyotard talk about quite clearly, and this acknowledgement of discursivity is one of the conditions of postmodernism, that you acknowledge the constant discursivity around you. Right? And you can't escape discursivity. Every moment is discursive. Now, within that particular discursive field, you have the choice, you have the agency as a subject to make iterations, to play different language games. Right? So, Lyotard talks about language games quite a lot in this particular context. Now, the moment you say language games, the moment you say that everything is discursive, every activity is within a particular discursive field, what that also means, what it also suggests is that there is no macro space out there. There's no macro public space out there where different language games blur away and we have some kind of a consensus created. Now that kind of an idea is very Habermasian, right? And at the end of postmodern condition, we find there's a bit of a argument that Lyotard takes up with Habermas. What is that argument? What is Lyotard's problem with Habermas? I mean, Habermas, of course, is a big advocate of the public space as a form of a consensus, a speciality for consensus from which decisions can be made and intellectual activities can happen. Now, why do you think Lyotard would be opposed to that kind of a idea of the public space? So why would postmodernism as a phenomenon be ontologically opposed to any idea, any assumption of a public space?
So getting a consensus on public space, basically it's again a kind of reinforcement of a grand narrative.
Okay, very good.
Which Lyotard is like not favoring of.
Yeah.
And he argues that if that happens, then there are always some sort of micro narratives which might be different from the grand narratives, which won't get any representation in such sort of grand narratives.
Right.
So then he argues for deconstruction of grand narratives so that the micro narratives can have their representation.
Exactly. So postmodernism as a phenomenon is not so interested in agreement in the first place. It's not so interested in a consensus in the first place. It's much more interested in fragmentation, in discontinuities, in other words, interstitiality. Right? What is interstitiality? In-betweenness. Right? In between two categories, liminality, interstitiality. So these become very important phenomena in postmodernism, and postmodernism as a movement, as a process, as a phenomenon is much more keen on those things rather than looking at some kind of a public consensus which can, like you said very correctly, very quickly convert into a grand narrative. Right? So the entire idea of becoming a grand narrative is questioned by postmodernism. Right? This brings us towards the end of the session, where I just make a little literary, put a little literary cream on the entire discussion and sort of ask you, what is the purpose of something like realism in the entire debate about representation, grand narrative, etc. So if you look at each of these texts that we've covered, I mean, Bhava spends a lot of time on realism, Lyotard spends a lot of time on realism, Butler spends a lot of time, but what is realism and why is realism so important to these philosophers, do you think? How is realism an important issue as a form of representation in literature, different kind of narrative strategies?
Realism, I think, it's rather popular. It manages to kind of makes one forget that it assigns roles that out of which one cannot, I don't know, one is given space to move.
Okay.
Kind of like we talk about Wickham and Darcy, as in both are kind of assigned to us to the point that Wickham couldn't ever speak.
Right, okay. So, but realism as, you're very right, but realism as a narrative strategy, what are the objectives of realism as?
Very totalizing.
Yes, it aims at a totalizing kind of representation. It seems to know everything in the heads of the characters. There's a beginning, middle, and end. Once upon a time, something happens, they lived happily ever. That's the realism narrative. They lived happily ever after. Now, obviously, this kind of a narrative technique would very quickly ally itself with grand narratives. Would very quickly ally itself with any kind of an hegemonic representation. So, realism is obviously a construct. Right? It's a construct which sort of tries to pass off as a given, tries to pass off as some kind of an all-knowing technique. Right? But of course, it's a fabulation because you can't really know what's happening in the minds of the characters. So in a very interesting sense, unreliable narration becomes a more authentic representation rather than realist narration, because in real life we don't know. We don't know what's happening in the heads of people around us. So essentially, if you're asked to represent people, we will become unreliable by default, right? So unreliable narration actually is a more authentic form of narration, and that's something that postmodernism picks up quite clearly. And if you look at postmodernism as a canon, although that's probably a bit of an oxymoron in terms, but however, if you look at postmodernism as a phenomenon, you find that it's something which keeps going back to unreliable narration. It goes back and digs up Tristram Shandy, it goes back and digs up different other texts, Don Quixote for instance, and then it comes into the major postmodernist writers, Borges, Joyce, I mean different other people, Martin Amis, John Fowler, so different postmodernist writers, they keep going back to unreliable narration as a more authentic form of narrative technique. And this move away from realism becomes a very discursive decision in postmodernism, right? Because realism, as all of you correctly pointed out, it very quickly allies itself to a totalizing technique and was best friends with imperialism, it was best friends with racism, it was best friends with any kind of patriarchal assumption about women, etc., because of its all-knowing assumption. It seems to know everything. It seems to sort of represent a very totalizing kind of a cosmos before you. So the entire ontology created out of realism is a very total ontology. It is completely complete. There's no incompletion in realism. And therein lies its fallacy. Therein lies its sort of a fabulatory quality, that it sort of fabulates, it imagines, it gives you the fantasy of completion, right? And this fantasy of completion, that is something that is questioned by all the theories that we have covered in this particular course, including Butler, Bhava, and then of course Lyotard as well. This entire fantasy of completion, that it's never really complete. The entire idea of a complete cosmos is a fantasy, which is more often than not very male and very racialized in quality. Okay, so this concludes the session. Thank you very much for your interactions, and I hope to see some of you again in the times to come. Okay, thank you.